Opens lines for the king's bishop and queen, immediately challenging central space and preparing for rapid development. Reclaiming the center. Black immediately mirrors white's ambition, setting the stage for a symmetrical battle of pawn and piece influence. Developing the knight to f3 immediately challenges black's central pawn and prepares for castling, hinting at aggressive intentions. Developing a knight to defend the central pawn creates a robust pawn structure and opens avenues for piece activity. Establishing immediate diagonal pressure on the knight. This move initiates the Ruy Lopez, a rich strategic battleground. Challenging the bishop immediately. A6 demands a decision and creates a slight queenside space advantage. Sacrificing a tempo to weaken black's pawn structure and create an isolated queen's pawn is a classic positional trade. Doubling the pawns significantly alters the pawn structure, creating weaknesses that might be exploited later. Solidifying the center. This pawn advance prepares for bishop development and restricts black's central influence. A bold claim for space, aiming to challenge white's central presence and prepare bishop activity. Developing the bishop here enhances queenside influence, aiming to castle soon and prepare central pawn advances. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal immediately pressures white's central pawns. Bolstering the center's pawn structure. This knight repositions to defend the pawn and prepare for further queenside development. The knight repositions, eyeing central squares and preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure. Challenging black's central pawn structure directly, forcing a decision on how to defend. Developing the knight to g6 initiates a central pawn push and aims to reinforce the king's safety, with a subsequent kingside pawn advance. Challenging the bishop immediately opens lines and potentially creates pawn weaknesses for black. Sacrificing the bishop this way relinquishes control of the dark squares and weakens your pawn structure significantly. Unlocking the queen offers significant central influence and can prepare an aggressive pawn push. Centralizing the queen offers better mobility and prepares for eventual kingside castling, while eyeing potential pawn weaknesses. Securing the monarch safely allows for future pawn advances and central expansion. Fortifying the monarch secures a vital outpost, preparing for eventual queenside expansion. Opening the e-file now intensifies pressure on black's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses. Unlocking the d-file now opens avenues for your queen and offers a chance to improve your pawn structure. Reclaiming the bishop immediately repositions a key piece, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain central influence. Reclaiming the d-file now solidifies black's central presence, reinforcing the central pawn complex while preparing to contest the d-file is the immediate priority. Reclaiming central influence. The bishop aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially eye the kingside, aggressively staking a claim on the central squares. This knight's excursion aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for further central pawn advances. Disrupting white's pawn structure provides attacking opportunities and opens the c-file for your rook. Asserting queenside pressure after the exchange, white repositions for potential central dominance. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside creates immediate attacking pressure, though it slightly neglects central control. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure against potential queen incursions, though it slightly hinders bishop mobility. Shifting the queen to c5 creates a direct threat to white's queenside pawn structure, putting pressure on the c2 square and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Expanding queenside space to disrupt black's harmony and potentially open a line for the rook. Seeking to unravel white's pawn structure, black reroutes the queen to a more active diagonal. Consolidating queen pressure on the queenside aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines. Knight infiltrates the weakened queenside, seeking to exploit the isolated pawns. Shifting the knight to the queenside creates a subtle threat of infiltration and begins to contest the queenside space black has consolidated, seeking to seize open files and disrupt white's pawn structure. This pawn thrust boldly challenges central control. Unlocking the c-file for pressure, white initiates a pawn exchange that reshapes the central tension and potentially opens lines towards black's king. Seizing the open c-file with the queen offers immediate counterplay and challenges white's central control. Securing the d-file with this rook shift aims to prepare for potential queenside pawn advances and connect your major pieces. Consolidating the pawn chain further solidifies the center, though it may surrender the d-file's open potential. Securing the king amidst the looming pawn structure disruption establishes a safer haven for further maneuvering. Expanding on the queenside, this pawn thrust contests central space and aims to destabilize white's pawn structure. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's central structure and expose their monarch. Re-establishing knights in the center signals a renewed fight for central control and offers new attacking possibilities. Repositioning the rook to the d-file aims to bolster central pawn support and prepare for potential advances or defensive maneuvers. Re-establishing the knight's influence on the queenside. This maneuver aims to contest the d-file and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Reclaiming the open file signals white's intent to dominate the center and pressure black's vulnerable queenside pawn structure. Shifting the queen to the active e7 square offers better piece mobility and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. Repositioning the monarch to a more active central square prepares for potential pawn advances and better king safety. Challenging white's central pawn control. Black aims to disrupt white's king's flank and create counterplay. A bold attempt to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and gain a foothold on the open c-file. Challenging white's pawn structure opens dynamic possibilities on the queenside. Realigning the knight aims to reroute pressure towards the queenside, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure. Sacrificing the exchange to dismantle white's queenside pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. Sacrificing the queen to gain an open file for your rook and initiate a pawn storm presents a dynamic endgame transition. The queen's repositioning creates a crucial outpost for the knight, disrupting white's central control and eyeing weaknesses. Re-establishing knight activity after the pawn storm, eyeing central squares and potential attacks. Strengthening the kingside pawn structure defensively addresses white's advancing knights and potential queenside pressure. Probing for weaknesses, white's queen aggressively targets black's pawn structure. This knight's daring journey to the edge of the board aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially land on a more active square. Unleashing a central pawn thrust disrupts black's queenside structure and opens attacking avenues. A daring venture to disrupt white's central grip, though it risks isolating the knight on the queenside. Reasserting central control. The rook now eyes the queenside advancement, preparing to neutralize threats. Initiating a risky queen sortie now exposes it to immediate central counterattacks and further weakens the king's already compromised security. Shielding your king and preparing a counterattack along the g-file are the goals here. Unleashing pawns towards the enemy king, aiming for a breakthrough amidst the clutter. unleashing a pawn storm to pry open lines, threatening the king's sanctuary. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black ignites an aggressive campaign for the white king. Unleashing the pawn's potential to shatter black's defenses and seize the initiative. Opening the f-file dramatically exposes your monarch, a perilous gamble for survival. Unmasking the king's defenses opens a decisive attack, forcing retreat and exposing weaknesses. Sacrificing the rook to unravel the queen's attack opens a new phase of the game. The monarch's forced march to freedom via the central squares seals its fate. Checkmate looms. The black king's escape route is now completely blocked by its own pawns, making its position increasingly perilous. Unleashing a decisive discovered attack. The white queen forces the black king into a perilous diagonal, securing the king amidst the chaos. Black prioritizes safety on his back rank, anticipating further complications. Exploiting the exposed monarch. This check forces black's king into a precarious, forced march, aiming to open lines for white's decisive attack. Sheltering the king behind pawns becomes a desperate gamble with open lines and material down. King's safety is now paramount. This knight repositions to bolster the threatened monarch. Desperate times call for desperate measures, but the king remains dangerously exposed to the advancing queen and knight. Initiating a mating attack, this check relentlessly hunts the exposed king. Black's king is now terribly exposed, making this a desperate attempt to deflect attention from the impending mating net. The reigning king is now exposed, inviting a swift tactical storm across the board. The king's exposed position invites a quick mating attack, so focus on defending that vulnerable monarch immediately. A decisive check, aiming to shatter the enemy king's precarious shelter and exploit the open lines. The black king, now dangerously exposed after the queen's sacrifice, desperately seeks refuge from white's relentless pursuit. Unleashing a pawn storm to rip open the king's defenses and create mating threats. Sacrificing the queen here opens lines, but it's a desperate attempt to distract from the unstoppable mating net closing in. The white queen captures the black queen, initiating a decisive endgame where material advantage will be paramount. The rook captures, concluding a complex tactical sequence and heading towards a pawn endgame where material is equal. The white king bravely ventures into the fray, seeking to participate in the final skirmish. The passed pawn's unstoppable march to promotion now looms large, drastically altering the endgame's complexion. The king now bravely ventures into the open, seeking to support the pawn push and exploit black's exposed queen. Opening the queenside pawns offers counterplay, but it might just accelerate the inevitable pawn push and king exposure. Simplifying the material is key, creating a more manageable endgame with the passed pawn. The pawn pushes forward, attempting to outmaneuver the rook and secure a crucial passed pawn. Pushing the rook forward offers a final, desperate attempt to disrupt the pawn storm. Unlocking the queenside with the passed pawn, black aims to disrupt white's consolidated position. Unleashing the king's power. This advance creates immediate attacking potential and restricts black's remaining pieces.